When German troops surrounded the wreckage of a burning American aircraft in Bavaria, they expected to find dead airmen or prisoners to interrogate. Instead, they found a wounded U.S. Army nurse. She had already treated over 500 Allied casualties, including enemy prisoners of war, while flying into active combat zones under fire. Now shot down, bleeding, and alone behind enemy lines, she faced a fate no American military nurse in Europe had ever faced before. The Germans hesitated, not because she was armed, not because she was an officer, but because what she represented did not fit their rules of war. Her name was Reba Z. Whittle, and history nearly forgot her.
By 1943, the air war over Europe had reached unprecedented brutality. American bombers were flying deep into German territory, suffering devastating losses. To keep crews alive, the U.S. Army created a dangerous and little-discussed role: air evacuation nurses, women who flew wounded soldiers out of combat zones under enemy fire. Second Lieutenant Reba Z. Whittle, born in 1911 in Virginia, was one of them. Assigned to the U.S. Army Air Force's Medical Air Evacuation Transport Squadron, Whittle treated shattered crews mid-flight, men burned, bleeding, and dying, often while aircraft were still being shot at. By mid-1944, she had already cared for hundreds of casualties, not just Americans, but also German prisoners of war, in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Combat triage was brutal but necessary. First, those who could return to duty. Second, those likely to survive with care. And finally, comfort for the dying. There was no glory, no headlines, just duty and danger. And then, in the summer of 1944, her aircraft was sent on one more mission.
On July 27, 1944, Whittle was aboard a C-47 Skytrain, flying a medical evacuation mission over southern Germany. German fighters intercepted the aircraft. Cannon fire tore through the fuselage. Shrapnel ripped into the cabin. Whittle was wounded by anti-aircraft fire, suffering injuries to her leg and back as the plane spiraled downward. The crew attempted an emergency landing. They failed. The aircraft crashed near Landsberg am Lech, deep inside Nazi territory. Some crew escaped. Whittle did not. German troops arrived quickly. They found her injured but alive, wearing U.S. insignia, a nurse's uniform, and a Red Cross armband. This created a problem. Nazi regulations had no category for an American female military nurse captured in combat aviation. She was neither civilian nor combatant by their definitions. Unsure what to do, they took her into custody. She had just become the only American military nurse captured and held as a POW in the European theater.
Whittle was transported to German custody facilities, injured and under guard. Unlike male POWs, she was isolated, questioned, and carefully observed. The Germans soon learned something unsettling. This woman they had captured had treated over 500 wounded soldiers, including German POWs, enemy men she had no obligation to save, yet did anyway. Under international law, nurses were non-combatants. Under Nazi ideology, women did not belong in combat zones at all. Whittle shattered both assumptions. Unsure how to proceed and wary of international consequences, German authorities classified her as a special prisoner, neither fully POW nor civilian detainee. Behind the scenes, diplomatic channels quietly opened. Her fate would not be decided by bullets, but by politics, embarrassment, and the fear of precedent. And still, back home, almost no one knew she was missing.
By August 1944, German military administrators realized they had made an unusual capture. Second Lieutenant Reba Z. Whittle
did not fit cleanly into any existing POW category. Under the 1929 Geneva Convention, medical personnel were to be repatriated rather than imprisoned, yet Whittle had been shot down during an operational flight over Germany. The Luftwaffe, the Wehrmacht, and diplomatic officials quietly debated her status. If she were treated as a civilian, it would expose Germany to accusations of violating international law. If treated as a POW, it would acknowledge that women served in U.S. combat aviation roles, something Nazi ideology openly rejected. Whittle herself remained under guard, injured and recovering. She was questioned, but not abused. German officers reportedly showed a mix of suspicion and restraint. They understood that how they handled her could set a precedent and attract international scrutiny at a moment when Germany was already losing diplomatic ground. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence still had no confirmation of her fate. For weeks she existed in bureaucratic limbo, a prisoner neither side had planned for.
Behind closed doors, negotiations began. Germany had something the United States wanted back, and something it did not want to keep. Holding a wounded American nurse carried no military advantage, only political risk. In September 1944, Whittle was included in a prisoner exchange via neutral Switzerland, a channel often used for wounded or protected personnel. The Germans did not publicize the transfer. Neither did the Americans. When she crossed into Allied hands, there was no ceremony. No reporters, no official statements, no recognition. She was quietly sent home to the United States for medical treatment. To the public, she had simply disappeared from the war. To the Army, her case raised uncomfortable questions. Why was a nurse flying combat missions? Why had she been wounded under fire? And how should the military explain a woman captured behind enemy lines? Those questions would follow her long after the war ended.
When Reba Whittle returned to the United States, she expected to recover quietly and perhaps resume nursing. What she did not expect was silence. Her injuries were treated, her service acknowledged privately. But her Purple Heart was initially denied, with officials arguing that nurses were not supposed to be exposed to direct combat. The implication was clear. If her suffering did not fit policy, it would not fit the record.
By the time Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, Reba Z. Whittle was no longer part of the public war narrative. Europe was collapsing. Camps were being liberated. Headlines belonged to generals and divisions, not nurses who had quietly done their duty. The U.S. Army Air Forces expanded its medical air evacuation system, eventually moving more than 1 million wounded personnel during the war. The flying nurses, male and female, became a logistical backbone of victory, though rarely mentioned in after-action reports. Whittle watched the war end from a distance. She did not attend victory parades. She was not interviewed. Her name appeared in no wartime documentaries. Official records listed her service, but not the full story of her capture, injury, or exchange. Like many medical veterans, she returned to a civilian world that had already moved on. The war ended in September 1945. Her recognition did not.
In the years after World War II, the U.S. military faced a challenge: how to tell the story of a war that had changed the rules. Women had served in forward areas. Nurses had flown into combat zones. Medical personnel had come under direct fire. But official policy had never anticipated this. Acknowledging Whittle's experience openly meant acknowledging that existing regulations were outdated and that women had already crossed lines the military claimed did not exist. So her case remained largely administrative, not narrative. This was not unique. Many nurses who served in evacuation units, field hospitals, and transport aircraft shared similar experiences. They practiced combat triage, treated enemy prisoners, and comforted dying soldiers, often without weapons,
armor or recognition. As one veteran would later summarize, "These nurses were angels in GP boots. Their heroism did not fit the mythology of war, and so it was quietly filed away."
It took decades for historians to re-examine the role of medical personnel in World War II and to realize what had been missed. As records were revisited, Whittle's case stood out. She had been wounded in enemy fire, captured, held by the Germans, and repatriated through a prisoner exchange, all while serving as a non-combatant nurse under international law. Eventually, the U.S. Army corrected the record. Reba Z. Whittle was awarded the Purple Heart, recognizing that her injuries were indeed sustained in the line of duty. It was not a public ceremony, but it was an acknowledgement, long overdue. Her story became a lens through which the contributions of thousands of medical personnel were finally understood, not as background figures, but as essential participants in the war.
By the end of World War II, the U.S. Army Air Force's medical air evacuation system had transported over 1 million wounded personnel from front lines to hospitals. Flying nurses worked inside unpressurized aircraft, often at night, often under fire. They performed emergency medicine with limited equipment, turbulence, and the constant threat of interception. They treated Allied soldiers first, but also enemy prisoners of war, in compliance with international law and medical ethics. This mattered. It meant that when German authorities reviewed Reba Whittle's record in captivity, they discovered something they did not expect: an American nurse who had already treated hundreds of casualties, including their own men. Her capture was not just unusual, it exposed a truth neither side emphasized during the war. The battlefield did not end at the firing line.
The Germans did not release Whittle out of kindness. They released her because holding her made no sense. She was not an intelligence asset. She was not a combat officer. And she had already upheld the laws of war by treating wounded German prisoners. German medical officers understood something fundamental. Medical neutrality mattered, even in a war defined by brutality. Her captivity remained short, controlled, and politically cautious. This did not mean compassion defined the system. It meant that in rare cases, rules still restrained chaos. Reba Whittle survived because those rules, fragile as they were, still existed.
Like many medical veterans, Whittle spoke little about her experiences. She had treated men who lived. She had comforted men who died. She had cared for enemy soldiers who would never know her name. One veteran's family story mirrors this silence. A nurse who prayed for a dying German pilot decades after the war, not because he was the enemy, but because he was human. This was the unseen cost of medical service. There were no victory tallies, only memories, and they lasted a lifetime.
When Whittle's Purple Heart was finally approved, it corrected a record, not a lifetime. There was no parade, no public campaign, no attempt to rewrite history loudly. And that, perhaps, was fitting. The flying nurses never sought attention. They sought stability in chaos. Their reward was not fame, it was survival for others.
Today, historians see Reba Whittle's story not as an anomaly, but as a signal. It marks the moment when traditional ideas about combat, gender, and service quietly failed to describe reality. Women had already crossed into danger. Medical personnel had already become targets, and modern warfare had already erased safe roles. Whittle did not change policy alone, but her experience revealed the truth sooner than most were ready to accept.
Reba Z. Whittle was not remembered because she was captured.
She was remembered because she served. She treated over 500 casualties, including enemy prisoners. She flew into danger without weapons. She endured captivity without recognition. And she returned home without demanding praise. History did not forget her because she lacked courage. History forgot her because courage like hers was quiet. And in war, the quiet stories are often the hardest to hear. And the most important to remember.
Stories like this survive only if they're told. Reba Whittle didn't seek recognition. Most never did. On this channel, we preserve the real human stories of war, the ones history nearly lost. If you believe these stories matter, subscribe. Not for the algorithm, but so they're never forgotten.